Good morning, everybody. How are you today? Wonderful. I am David Markward. I'm the Director of Grand Rapids Parks and Recreation. Very pleased to be here today. To those of you that have been a part of our planning processes over the last few years in master planning, welcome back. It's good to have you a part of this conversation today. To those of you that might be new to this process in this conversation, we are here engaging with professionals from across the country, working on ways in which to improve walkability to our city's parks. And that means, in the long term, expanding access to parks and adding parks where they might be most needed within our city. We are very pleased and honored to be working today in partnership with the Urban Land Institute of Michigan. We are very grateful for your participation in this work and selection of Grand Rapids for this important project. But even more grateful to this team of volunteers that you see to my left here. We've got volunteers and professionals from across the country, all the way from Los Angeles to Boston. And these individuals have carved some significant time out of their own personal and professional schedules to come and be with us here in Grand Rapids to share their insight, to share their expertise, and to share some really good examples of ways in which our city can incorporate some of the important invaluable lessons that they've learned in their work. So with that, I'd like to invite Melanie up to start our presentation today.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you to you all for being here. I'm Melanie Smith. I'm an Urban Land Institute member, and I'm an urban planner from Los Angeles, and it has been great to get to spend a little bit of time in Grand Rapids, although I have to say, not a relaxing couple of, two and a half days, but great to be here. So for those of you who don't know, Urban Land Institute is an international organization, and our mission is to provide leadership in the responsible use of land in creating and sustaining thriving communities worldwide. We have a large membership globally, and a really big way in which members connect into the organization and contribute is to come really and do study visits like this, other kinds of advisory services panels that happen across the country and actually around the world. So it's a way in which we can really contribute our expertise to addressing issues that are rising locally all over the country. Specifically in this case, we're really excited that Urban Land Institute is a part of and partnering with other organizations in the 10-Minute Walk campaign, and other partners of the Trust for Public Land represented here today, the National Recreation and Park Association as well. And this is promoting a really big idea that all Americans should live within a 10-minute walk of a park. And so that's something that, a notion that has been endorsed by 240 mayors across the country, including your own Mayor Bliss here in the city of Grand Rapids. So this is an exciting opportunity for different organizations to be collaborating around a big idea like this. And so we thought, though, we'd stop for just a second. I think probably you came here this morning, so I suspect you all already know this, but that we thought we'd start by sort of addressing the question of why parks. And that parks are really about a lot of things, about more than just play alone, and that there are a lot of benefits and co-benefits that come from investing in a park system in a community. And a lot of those things are up here on the slide today, but we'll get into a few of them. Not least of which is the economic impact of parks. And we've seen that a lot of Americans really feel a very strong, high level of support for living near parks, and that they feel that this is an important kind of characteristic of their communities. It's something that businesses look at. Parks and open space systems are part of the decision-making process that businesses look at as they think about where to locate, and investors look at the quality of a parks and recreation system as part of their decision making as well. And then we see that there are really property value increases for locational proximity to parks and park systems. So there's a lot of economic benefits in addition to others. But there's so many co-benefits of parks and park systems that are really starting to get a lot of attention, and it's something that some of us professionals are really getting very interested in. Is looking at really the ways in which everything is connected to everything else. So when we're thinking about parks, we're thinking about, yes, access to play and recreation and active and healthy lifestyles, so that there's these health benefits, and that there's the benefits of folks being able to come together in public space and strengthening community bonds. We see mental health benefits from access to open space and being in open space and physical improvements. And there's also environmental and sustainability benefits from parks and park spaces. We can see sort of multi-purpose, multi-function open space that really providing a range of benefits in communities now, and then as our climate continues to change, that there are going to be ongoing, really important aspects of parks in our communities in the future, and our this access to parks is something we're going to come back to over and over again too. So a minute about Grand Rapids. Again, we wanted to commend the leadership and commitment of Mayor Bliss in signing on to this initiative, and the leadership of your Parks and Rec organization here. David and Catherine and Carrie have been such great supporters to the whole process and to us this week as well. And they've been, as you all know, a 10-minute walk grantee, and the work's was started actually in the end of 2017, and so this work's been ongoing and will continue after we leave. This is one piece of it. But the focus of the 10-minute walk grant program and the focus here has been really on a specific geography within the city, an area of the city in which we've seen that there are more disparities in terms of socioeconomic health and amount of park space and park investment, in particular, a particular subset geography outlined in red that you see on the slide. A number of neighborhoods included within this geography. So the focus is really about trying to address some of those disparities that have developed over time, reducing park deficits, and creating and maintaining inclusive park spaces for the future going forward, and thinking about access. So you'll hear these themes that are going to come up time and time again. So we do have a diverse group of national experts, as we've said, that's come and joined us here this week, and we've had a great, as I said, a great busy time. We'll talk a little bit more about what we've been doing. I'm not going to introduce every person, but we've got folks that are park professionals, folks that focus on economic development, on acquisition, on landscape architecture, the gamut, and planning, like myself. They'll introduce themselves as each of them comes up. So the city, in framing the work that we're going to talk about today, gave us some study questions. And they kind of fell into three major buckets that you see up here on the screen. And really about thinking about physical geography in the city, and thinking about where there are actual locations for new parks that would have the most significant impact toward achieving these 10-minute walk access goals throughout the city, and specifically in the neighborhoods of focus in the first and third wards. And then looking at policies and financing structures and strategies that would facilitate this happen, so that the city would have the ability to meet its goals of acquiring new park land in these areas. And then looking at criteria for that acquisition of parkland. So really trying to facilitate what's going to be an ongoing effort within the city to really think about the criteria for deciding what are appropriate sites to acquire for park spaces. So those are kind of the three big areas. So since we've been here, and actually before we arrived, we've been taking advantage of briefing materials that the city provided us with, and access to folks. Some of you are in this room, and some that aren't here today, that we've been able to interview and get a lot of great information from in a short period of time. We've toured the study area. We had a really great tour of a lot of the spaces. We've seen spaces that exist, and improvements that have been made as a result of your millage that you've had in place for a while now. And then we've been really focused on developing actionable recommendations for you, which you're going to see us all talk about in a second. And here we are today at our public presentation. So, when I reviewed the study questions, you saw that there was a real focus on acquisition strategies. And, that's obviously, and correcting disparities of park space provision, right, within certain areas of the city. And as we came to the city and we really absorbed your briefing materials, and we had this opportunity to really learn from a variety of stakeholders that we were able to interview during this process, it's become clear to all of us, we really all came to the conclusion at the same time that this is a complicated and sort of multifaceted issue. And so we're going to talk about acquisition, but we're really going to talk about four kind of major things, themes that we think are important for the city to consider as it moves forward. So we're going to talk about communications and engagement, and really an engagement process with the residents and of a variety of stakeholders in these neighborhoods to really fuel an acquisition strategy in the future. We're going to talk about improvements that could be made in the short and long term to access to the parks and network the parks within the city itself. We're going to talk about funding strategies and a really broad look, we think, at funding, potential funding strategies for both capital improvements and operations and maintenance. The instant you get any of us talking about, parks and park systems, we think about not just today, not just getting the land, but then what do we do when we've got it, right? And how do we maintain and operate a system over time to the level of quality that we'd really want to see? And then we're going to talk about criteria for acquisition as well. So key things, four key things. Really quickly, just to very quickly summarize sort of some of the things we've heard and observed. Again, in our briefing materials, our conversations with city staff and other stakeholders, Grand Rapids residents love their parks, right? And we know that there's this commitment to funding the park system over time. And we think that the Parks Department is doing a lot with a little. We've been very impressed with the level of improvements that have been made with millage revenues. Though we're hearing numbers, we're feeling like these dollars have been efficiently spent in terms of what you've gotten for them. And that we recognize that an equity framework and a lens is really underpinning a lot of city's decision making across the board, and so that's great. That there's alignment around that, in many planning efforts throughout the city. And that there are dedicated partners we can build on, you all can build on as you go forward, and that there has, this attention has been paid to identifying these areas that really need the most intervention. And so that's great. And there's an opportunity now to piggyback planning efforts that are going on in multiple dimensions. So infrastructure planning, the bike system planning that's happening, the citywide master plan update that's going to happen. There's a way to really align all these efforts with efforts to expand the park system. And you have a great parks master plan that was just completed recently that you can build on. So of course there are challenges. You wouldn't have asked us here. You wouldn't have signed on to the 10-minute walk campaign if there's always challenges. And so millage funding, the level of funding that you get now is primarily focused around capital improvements and doesn't fund operations and maintenance beyond your pool facilities. So we think, operations and maintenance, that's something we really focus on and want to think about strategies for. We commend the Parks and Recreation staff with what they're doing, but it's clear that they're underfunded and understaffed, and that's something that we think that should be addressed. There is deferred maintenance in the park system, as you know. That's certainly something that's been prioritized, needs to continue to be prioritized to address the deferred maintenance. And that there needs to be broader thought about really preparing a strategy for acquiring new lands and then being able to operate and maintain them as time goes on. So there's probably a broad approach to that. And we've heard from stakeholders that we've interviewed that the neighborhoods that are really target neighborhoods to address these sort of equality and issues in want more ownership over the park planning process. They want to be engaged. They're asking to be engaged as the experts in those local communities. And we've of course heard, and this is not, again, not a unique thing in Grand Rapids, but there is a historic mistrust between residents and the city. It has manifested to some extent in some decision making around parks. And so that's something that we want to be mindful of in our recommendations about how to overcome that. So with that, we're going to start with communication and engagement strategies, and I'm going to hand over to Daryl to get us on our way.
So good morning. I'm Daryl Ford. I'm from the City of Los Angeles Department of Recreation and Parks. I'm going to talk to you today about the first theme. This is communication and engagement. And this is really about setting forth a process, an ongoing dialogue that you're going to have with the community to make sure that their input is able to be given to the city so that you have good projects that are well supported by the community. But communication engagement is absolutely critical to doing that. It's really about having a customer service focus. Community engagement is about building relationships. It's about communicating what your successes are. It's about being transparent with the community about what's happening and what's going on and what's to come. It's about data gathering. It's about understanding who you've talked to, who you haven't talked to, where you've gone, where you haven't gone, who you can find and who you can't. The key to that community engagement is really understanding where are we having success and reaching people and where are we not. It's absolutely critical to know that you are talking to the community members, that you are engaged with them, and that they're able to give you their input through a transparent process. And then activation. Really, good activation of a park or a park space or a place you're going to acquire for the community to use, that good activation comes when you've had good community engagement. When you really understand what the community wants and needs, you're able to activate spaces and facilities the way that they will use them and they will love them and they will cherish them. So that community engagement is critical to making sure your parks and your facilities are well activated. And then evaluation. Community engagement is really about developing a process. It's about putting together a process where you consistently and ongoing go out to the communities and have conversations with them. It's about a process that's not just around one initiative or one project or one park or one site. It's ongoing. Even when there are things that are not actively happening, you should always be engaged in the community. And that's the important thing to take away from that, is that community engagement is an ongoing activity that must be done. So the first thing is that customer service focus. Dedicated staff are critical. You have to have a dedicated staff whose job it is to be engaged in the communities, whose job it is to learn the folks in the community, to learn the players in the community, to learn and figure out the people who are not being heard, who don't have those traditional avenues of reaching out to the city or reaching out to the decision makers. It's about setting aside the funding and the time to have a dedicated person who can engage in that. Because having that established point of contact, that's relationship building. You need to be able to make sure that network is put together. And having a dedicated staff person who really understands all the individual communities here in Grand Rapids, who really has the ability to go into a community on the north side one day and then down here in wards 1 and 3 on another day. That is absolutely critical to have a dedicated staff member to that. Transparent communication. So here's something we pulled from the city's equity statement as a part of the strategic plan that's going forth. And I'll just read it back to you. So the city defines equity as the condition achieved when people have the tools, resources, and connections necessary to be fully engaged and prepared to benefit from the opportunities they seek. Community engagement is a tool. It's the tool that enables you to make connections. So when you have an equity focus, having a community engagement strategy gives folks those tools to be engaged so they can make those connections, so that they can be a part of the process and they can benefit from that process. And it's about trust building. It really is about trust building. It's about active, ongoing communication with folks so they know that you're there, they know where to go, they know who to talk to. And it's about owning your successes. This is a very important thing I think we wanted to highlight. The example here is a sign for a capital improvement project in the city of Orlando. There should be signage at all the projects the city is doing. The city should be proud of the successes that it's had and how it's been spending the citizens' money. And they should let folks know what's coming up soon, what's been going on, what's been happening in the community, so that people, when they go to a park or the facility, they have an idea, like what's coming soon or what's been done. It helps to sort of own that success so that the community has some level of confidence going back and forth that the city is really using its resources well. The city's doing a good job. The city should be proud of that, and the city should own its success. And that's a critical part about communication, community engagement. It's that back and forth. It's really talking about the successes you've already had as well. And data gathering. So it's very important that, again, you do an annual, key strategy is to do an annual survey. Because, again, you don't know what you don't know, and if you don't ask, you'll never know it. So it's key to get out into those communities, to ask these questions, and again, have that be an ongoing standard process, to always be reaching out. Because again, communication is always a back and forth, it's always interaction, it's something that must be done all the time. And then mapping it and some of the technology tools. Again, as you start to do that ongoing community engagement, it's important to figure out where you're getting responses from, where you're not, what communities you're having difficulty in, where you need some more assistance or maybe help from local neighborhood groups or local folks to really touch bases with the folks who are not coming to your meetings, who are not actively engaged. And there's a lot of tools out there that can help you to sort of figure out where you're having difficulty in reaching through and breaking through. But just again, as a part of an ongoing process, it's important to make sure that you're gathering that data about who you're able to interact with and where. In activation, really engagement, it leads to the city getting good information, which leads to things that are supported by the community. Those are just the basics. So if you're talking to folks and you're getting their input and you're using their input, you're going to build facilities, you're going to acquire sites, you're going to do programming things that are supported by the community and that strengthen the community and that they feel engaged in. So that engagement is really critical to making sure at the end of the day, you end up with something that everybody loves, everyone will use, and everyone is happy that the city did. And that's the critical part about that. And just finally, again, it's that customer service focus. It's always thinking about your community engagement as you would if you were, a Fortune 500 company. You don't interact with a big business unless you have a phone number you can call or a person you can go to for a complaint or for praise or whatever it may be. The government is customer service, and this is a key thing, is to always think of yourself as a customer service focus. So that communication engagement really comes from that, and it needs to be sustained. It just needs to be an ongoing and continuous process, not a process that ramps up or ramps down around key time periods, but something that's going on all the time, because that's what builds trust. Trust is when people know you're in the community all the time, not just when you are there for an ask, not just when you need one question answered, but when you're there on a constant basis because you're there to listen. So the three things I take away from this, the three questions you should always ask yourself when you're doing community engagement, the three questions we kind of want to pose is, think of a project and say to yourself, have we talked to the community? What are the community's thoughts on this? And has the community had any interaction on this? Has there been any iterative back and forth? If you say no to any of those things, then you need to do more community engagement, because you need to know those answers. You need to be confident in those answers before you move forward with something, because that way you've reached out, they've had time to think about something, and they've had time to react to something and give you feedback. Those things are critical so you feel comfortable and confident that you have reached out and done the right amount of community engagement and discussion. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to talk about park access.
Thanks, Daryl. I'm Rachel Banner with the National Recreation and Park Association, and I have a bit of a bias in that we've been working with the Grand Rapids team this last year on the 10-minute walk campaign, but I'm so happy to be here. And I think important to set the context for both park access and community engagement is, as we were going through this process of looking at the study questions around acquisition, we really felt like we needed to build the base so that when land was acquired and developed into new park space, that we had the tools in our toolbox already set and ready to go. And I think that there are some simple actions that we can take to improve that trust, really build that foundation so that when we do acquire land and redevelop new land, that we have that trust and that we have sort of that working relationship already set, and some of those operations and maintenance already ongoing. And so one of those key areas in which we felt like we could build on that base is through park access. There are really three ways that I think about park access. So that's connections to the broader community. So what are those pedestrian connections, walking connections? How is that connected to stores, businesses, residences? The second is sort of, are parks welcoming? Just do people feel comfortable? Do they feel like they belong in that park? And then the third is really, does the park itself or the macro level provide the features that are needed in order to gain access to the parks? And I think what we heard throughout these last couple of days from residents sort of reflects a little bit of that. So we heard that really entries into sort of the small micro scale of the parks or between parks or other community networks really could be improved, that currently some of them are blocked, invisible, hard to access, particularly given folks with different mobility challenges. The second is that connections between parks could be strengthened. So one example we heard in particular was between Roosevelt and Clemente Park. There were organic trails happening between the two parks, but they were along dangerous routes, and folks didn't feel as comfortable using those connections but wanted to see connections between those parks. And then the third really big bucket of things that we heard were that events and programming were needed to draw folks into the parks, and that the parks were doing a fairly good job with that, but things like lighting and safety, attendance were affected by how people were getting to those parks, by the feeling that they got inside those parks. And so looking at how we can improve lighting and improve safety was essential. So thinking about how we can improve park access, again, this is the destinations or the walk, that broader connectivity. The 10-minute walk campaign is all about this. How do we connect people to parks and parks to people within a 10-minute walk of home? We know that that 10-minute walk is really critical in order to get people of all abilities to easily access that park. And in addition, it needs to be a place that they are wanting to go to, a park that has the features and amenities that the community is looking for. I think one thing in particular that we were hearing was there were a lot of amenities for children. I think the school park joint use agreement has been tremendously successful in the city of Grand Rapids, but sometimes that left out features for people, older adults in particular, where maybe they would want more of a gathering space. And then in order to get there, again, ensuring safety, so lighting, crossings, traffic calming, barrier-free access, comfort and accessibility by multiple modes, in particular, when we were talking with residents in terms of traffic safety, there was a few corridors where there were trucks running through the parks, or it was a corridor where folks just really didn't even think about crossing the street into the park space. And so thinking about that 10-minute walk, that's not even a possibility for them. So addressing some of those connection challenges. And then also thinking about challenges even larger than that, so transportation, bike networks, and bus rapid transit. I think it's really important to play on some of the successes that we've already had through these three different modes of transportation. A lot of folks actually said that the parks were on those bus routes, and so thinking about future acquisitions, ensuring that they are continuing to be on those bus routes. The Vital Streets Initiative already prioritizes park access, so continuing to build out those priorities and working together on those joint access issues. And then finally, the bikeway improvement plans, just ensuring connectivity with the city planning. And the second sort of large macro is really connecting into ecological or green features within the city. So are we following riverways or natural ecological sort of pathways in the city and playing on the strengths of Grand Rapids in terms of your environmental features? And then micro access. So this is sort of at the site level. Are people able to enter into the park, move throughout the park to get to the features that they're interested in? And some ways to improve this are connections and visibility to and from adjacent communities. Sometimes a park can be fairly large, and ensuring that we have entrances from each side of that park, or really opening up the borders or edges of the park so that any neighborhood on either side could easily get to that space. New mobility options and services. So folks were talking about a potential new bike share. So ensuring that we have community dialogue about where those bike share locations are implemented. A lot of what we see nationally with bike share is that folks are wanting to use this actually for passive recreation as opposed to always a mobility option. And the place where they want to be using these bike shares is in parks and open spaces. And so coordinating bike shares. Signage and wayfinding, the city has already started to do this with their Bikeways program and the Department of Health. So continuing the success, but broadening it to entrance signs and signs for walking, connections to parks, etc. Intuitive pathways. So this is, do the pathways inside of a park lead to the things that you're wanting to go to? And are those pathways also accessible via different modes of transportation, whether that be bike or wheelchair or walker, so that folks can get to the places in those parks? Barrier-free access within the space and on the way to it. So you don't want to get to the end of a street and have to walk around another half mile to that park entrance again. Site lighting, this was mentioned by several residents, particularly in a city where it's cold and dark in the wintertime, and at 5 o'clock you may actually want lighting, even though technically the park closes at dusk, for things like programmed activities such as soccer games or community gatherings that may happen at different times of year. And then access for a wide range of populations. So thinking about spaces for older adults, which I've mentioned quite a bit here, gender neutral restrooms was mentioned, wheelchair access at picnic tables, which has been started, and we'd love to see that success just continue from here. And then restroom access generally was mentioned. And this is going to increase your utilization of parks. Moms are going to stay there longer because their kids have somewhere to go to the bathroom. While this is a maintenance challenge, it's certainly something that folks felt like was a priority all year round, and not just in summer months. And so, again, thinking about access is a strategy to work on currently to build the momentum for future park acquisitions and think about how you're connecting those future park acquisitions to what you already have in your wonderful system.
Good morning, I'm Doug Hadaway with the Trust for Public Land, and to share some of our observations and thoughts regarding specifically acquisition, and it's the forward button, which is that button, thank you. First, the baseline. We understand that Grand Rapids is a fairly built out community, but there is land and opportunities still there to effectively retrofit. And that's what you've got to keep in mind is not only the limitations of not only developed land, but also the smaller size parcels that exist that have developed upon, particularly in those high park deficient areas, which we have been informed is wards 1 and 3. So we have been looking at wards 1 and 3 particularly to help provide and further equity goals. So then we also believe that working with the community, working with the neighbors, whether there is a neighborhood association or not. If you're thinking about retrofitting and trying to reduce that 10-minute walk deficit area, it's very important and in fact drives your acquisition strategy of understanding what that community wants and needs. Pocket parks, for example, especially in these neighborhoods that have park deficiency measures, they are very effective in reaching a lot of people with minimal amenities, providing a little passive space for people to go and connect with nature, and there's value in that. These needs and wants that would be expressed by the residents that are most proximal to them, it really is what would drive your acquisition decisions. As tempted as we might be in the conservation and parkland world that we work and breathe and live in, it's always presumptuous to go in thinking we think based upon our prior experience what probably will work here.
But in order to get the community and the neighbors buy-in, it's really important to have a survey, have that coffee talk with them, whatever it takes to get an understanding of what those needs are, because that'll translate into what am I looking for to acquire? Am I looking for a large piece? Am I looking for a flat piece? Am I looking for a small piece, etc.? So we do recognize, though, that there are limitations that you've got to work with in a built environment here in Grand Rapids. So are we looking at new parks and expansions of parks? Well, let's just face it. If it's a built environment, we have to be opportunistic. Quite frankly, you have to seize the moment as the moment arises. You don't have the luxury of, well, you do need to plan ahead. Let me make sure that that's clear so you're fulfilling the needs of your community. But once you know that, where the land deal is going to happen is very opportunistic. And so you've got to be ready for it. But ready means having money and having the staff that are just sitting there waiting for that opportunity to arrive, and that's not likely either, because money is always stretched thinly. You don't have enough money to fulfill your goals and dreams, and often the staff are, as we already heard, that the Parks and Rec staff here in the city are understaffed, overstretched. And so to be ready, though, understanding these limitations, there are some low-hanging fruit that could be considered that are low cost and are already out there. Believe it or not, there are vacant tracts out there. We saw them, we found them in wards 1 and 3. There are other institutions that are holding land. I guess I understand the winding down, last known as Innovalab, the Kent County Land Trust, I guess, is winding down. Here is a low-hanging fruit opportunity. We did notice a parcel or two in the target areas that are owned by them. What's happening with those right now? What about tax delinquent parcels? There are, if you're talking about a little postage stamp park in a neighborhood because it's already been developed and you found a vacant lot, it happens to be owned by one of these land-holding institutions, like I said, the land bank, or if it's in tax delinquency, there's an opportunity there, and it wouldn't be costing a lot of money to seize that opportunity, a lot of bang for the buck. Underutilized sites as well. There are properties that we saw out there that have properties that are not in good repair or not fully utilizing the entire space of it, including larger than just simple housing lot sites that need to be looked at and highlighted. Mapping, Darrell had mentioned mapping and GS mapping. Using these tools to help highlight these opportunities that are out there is a great way of communicating with the neighbors to say, here's what we're trying to do, what are we looking for here in your community, what's important to you, and oh, here are some actual opportunities. We realize there's a translation between the dream and what you'd like to see and what the physical reality and legal realities are. So have that GIS mapping as a tool to help you translate the dream into actual practice. Connectivity. We also noticed in these wards, in the Parks and Rec Master Plan, highlights connectivity between the parks as well. I like, personally and professionally, these linear type parks, and because especially in the built environment, if you already have a linear feature, whether it be a utility line, which could be repurposed as a trail for connections between the parks or other destinations, a shopping area, job, etc. Railroads, you have the, I think it's Baltimore and Ohio Railroads, maybe it's CSX, I'm not sure who that is now, but that is cutting right through. We were fortunate, the park deficient area, we were fortunate that the Parks and Rec staff have already done analysis as to where the park deficient areas are, and you can't ignore not only the railroad there, and it doesn't mean it's for sale. I work with railroads, it's very, very difficult, but the opportunity to approach them, talk to them about their long-term plans. A rail with trail is an option. Some railroads don't like it, some do. Natural features, you have Plaster Creek. Yes, it goes into the neighboring city, but back and forth in and out of Grand Rapids. That's also in one of the park deficient areas, and it's already mostly owned by the city, so very minimal pathways could be incorporated into that. And these linear features are my favorite because it has the most bang for the buck. You're not only creating connectivity, but it's providing access and nailing that 10-minute walk goal that you're trying to achieve, as opposed to a square park surrounded by residences, which is just a factor of the distance around that one little piece. You have a linear park connecting neighborhoods, let alone neighbors. And then, of course, thinking about connections to them, another mode of transportation, bikeways, and transit. This is all interlocked together. You've got to think about moving people around, not just, yes, there's value in touching the trees and seeing the water going by you, but there's also a function, and there's getting from point A to point B for a lot of people, where, especially in communities that where transportation is typically the second highest household expense, and providing another alternative economical way to get from point A to point B is very useful. Land evaluation criteria. So here's a stab. We did see a draft, I believe it was a draft, a first stab by Parks and Rec staff to come up with some criteria. So some of them, they're all captured in here, and then here's some others. And these are no particular order, but getting that neighborhood buy-in and support. I'm imagining a nomination form, right? This is a voluntary program. We're not going to use eminent domain because that's not very popular. Some places do, but it's very rare for parks and recreation purposes. But so getting the buy-in is really critical, because then as you're looking at a piece of land, you know whether that's going to further the need and actually get the support that you need from the community. You don't want to be imposing by putting a park in a place that people are saying, actually, we don't want it there, we want it over here instead. So that communication is very important. Intermodal connectivity can be a criterion that says, is this located in a place that allows people to get there using other modes of transportation, such as biking, walking, and busing? Obviously, is it furthering other city vision and goals? This isn't a city all about parks and recreation. There's other goals and criteria that other departments are trying to achieve, economic development. You know, is it helping to multitask some of this other cities' goals? Income and health indicators, work with the county health department. There's some great information there to prioritize. I'm talking about a scoring point here, where you know that there's demographic health indicators that need improvement, and we know that there's a correlation between access to parks and improved health. Visible locations is another one. Is it on a corner? Is it in a place that can be seen and that attracts more use to the property? Natural and historical features, very, very important. There may be, the neighbors in the neighborhood might have cultural, historical identity with a particular area or piece of land, whether it's tied to a person or just an event or a gathering. That's very important and might be prioritized as well. Natural features adjacent to water, let's say, or other natural features. These are all criteria you can use to prioritize. And then funding partners. Funding is never enough, so if you have the ability to leverage with a complementary use with another funding partner, that is another criterion that could be used. Land control methods. It's not all or nothing. You don't necessarily have to buy it lock, stock, and barrel, fee simple title, otherwise known as. You have other tools that you can use to further your park deficient need, not further the need, further your needs for providing more parks and access. Easements is a great way to do it. You've got power lines. Look at the utility lines, water sewer lines, which often are already owned by our city department or county department or related common entity that you work very closely with. They can be multi-purposed into furthering connectivity or parkland use. Licenses and leases. You know, you might have a landowner that's like, I'm happy, I'm not selling, but I'm willing to allow, because I've got a big piece of land, to have some public use on the property. Yes, there's liability issues you have to work through. I don't know how it is in Michigan, but there are some states that have passed a statute that say if you're allowing openly the public to access your property, we indemnify you. I don't know how that works here if you have such an opportunity. Land swaps, another inexpensive way. There's other land holding institutions that are out there, educational, health, affordable house, the Grand Rapids Housing Commission, another example. They're also opportunistic. They might have some land that they got that they're not really using or doesn't really fit what they're focusing on. You might have some land that they have an interest in to further their interest. Land swaps is a great way to do it without all cash. Or perhaps you have a very specific piece of land. You're like, nope, we know where it is. They're not ready now, but hey, would you mind giving us a first right of refusal so that when you do plan to sell, you're obligated, if you will, to give us a call and give us the opportunity to buy it first, with some advantages to help incentivize that success opportunity. So there's just a lot of ways you can further control of land without actually buying it straight up. And collaboration. You've already heard and you already know, we're preaching to a lot of you all that work in this area, and so you know how important parks are for so many different facets. It's more than just recreation and touching a tree, although that is premise of the importance of parks. But the fact that they also promote economic development, and by the way, I'm highlighting that what we saw is a wonderful program to share uses with the schools. Awesome. That's an effective way to do it, economical way to do it, and schools are usually where people live too. So we applaud the shared use agreements that are already going on with the school board or school district. That's happening, and that's fantastic. So we encourage more of that. Utility companies, land banking, and land trusts. I work for a land trust. I should highlight those organizations too. So there's help out there for people to do exactly what you're trying to do. There's land trusts that are involved with environmental education or environmental preservation. That's a very important part of Parks and Recreation, is connecting people to nature. And so there are resources out there in the private and nonprofit areas that can help you bridge the gap. Thank you. I heard about the Nature Center acquiring a property to further their interest, and they had help from a national land trust called the Conservation Fund that loaned the money to buy the land and an opportunity to raise the capital, pay it back over time. Perfect example. And then I'll hand this over to Ryan, another specific example that we saw that Parks and Rec staff took us on a little bus tour. We looked at some sites. Obviously, they were showing us some sites that they were thinking about. Is this a good one here? And so Ryan took that and went with it. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. My name is Ryan Cambridge. I am a landscape architect, but also a park planner from Indianapolis. This was a site owned by the Kent County Drainage Commission, is that right? Yeah, so it was mentioned to us not just on the site tour, but also a handful of times by residents and stakeholders. And so while there's a lot of study that needs to be done to vet the feasibility of anything done on this site, we wanted to try to use it as a case study in this sort of limited process to give an example of how you can take an underutilized site and meet your infrastructure needs while also meeting your needs for recreation and open space. So currently this is just a depressed drainage area, all green space with a fence, 6-foot fence around the entire property. Now you can, through different ways of handling the same volume of stormwater, whether you're using subsurface detention, rain gardens and bioswales for pre-treatment, you can achieve the same infrastructural purpose while also working to improve community health through providing ways for additional recreation, through increasing community-wide connectivity and not just walkways and pathways, but also multimodal connectivity. At the same time as you're restoring habitat through green infrastructure. And hopefully over time, as you make improvements like this that are strategic and community assets, not just infrastructural pieces, you can help encourage or facilitate some additional redevelopment to occur around the park. So of course there's an economic component as well. And I think it's important to emphasize, while you look at projects like that and you're like, well, it's owned by a drainage authority, or that's a utility, that's a complicated thing, they may be difficult to deal with. I want to encourage you that it definitely can be done. And so this is an example of a project I work on in a community very similar in terms of its challenges, in terms of really rapid growth of very limited available land, where they were able to take a 9-acre regional transmission line easement owned by Florida Power and Light, and take that property, acquire it, only to find out that it is used primarily also for stormwater from the neighborhoods to the north. So their goal was, can we take this parcel that really can't be used for anything and convert it into a dog park, but we still need to meet these infrastructural needs of easements and stormwater. And through the design of subsurface basins and different connectivity pieces, they were able to transition this into a destination dog park, 7-acre dog park, that also still has 2.3 acres of subsurface detention and is still a utility easement for Florida Power and Light. So it definitely can be done. And so as we were talking about acquisition, as Doug mentioned, it's really important that you don't write off any parcels because, it might be contaminated, or, this is a condition that exists today, because there's enough tools in our toolbox where from a design side that you can overcome a lot of these challenges while still meeting some infrastructural needs that may need to be addressed as well. Now I'm going to turn it over because all these are great ideas, but they don't go really anywhere without some money. So, John?
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. I'm John Trementozzi from Landwise Advisors based in Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm going to talk to you a little bit about funding, both looking at the current revenue streams, how they're used and allocated, as well as touching a little bit about future funding mechanisms and opportunities to fund, future projects. I'm actually going to focus on the capital piece, and then I'm going to hand it over to Aaron to talk about operations and maintenance. So the first thing to point out around capital funding is the parks millage, which, as you know, was approved in 2013, has been really successful in creating new spaces, new park spaces, new playgrounds, new amenities for the system, particularly in some of these underserved areas. Right now, the millage produces about $4 million a year, $3 million of which is used specifically for capital projects and only $1 million to maintenance. This is obviously a critical tool, so the hope is that it gets reapproved and will be in place in the future to fund improvements across the system. Thinking forward about other opportunities and where future dollars might come from, specifically for capital, we have noted that there's actually a very strong philanthropic infrastructure here. The city already has some pretty strong partnerships with various foundations and entities within the region to help fund parks and other projects. And so we just want to highlight that those relationships should really be fostered and strengthened moving forward. And it allows the park system to do new projects, acquire new land, but not have to go it alone. It's not reasonable for parks to have to do it all on their own. The one thing we did want to point out is that when you're reaching out to these organizations and working with them, it's important to be very specific about what the ask is. It needs to really align with that foundation or organization's mission. That's critical. And on top of that, because these are capital projects, we really want to focus on these sort of visionary, game-changing type of projects, not the run-of-the-mill things that donors can't get excited about. We should be using and tapping into other dollars to get those done. One other thing, I just want to go back. So I don't think I touched on the images here. This is Ottawa Hills. This is part of that shared use program with the public schools. A recent capital improvement project that we think is just a great addition to the neighborhood, universally accessible design, and a really high quality project. So those dollars are being put to good use. In thinking about how current dollars are allocated, we wanted to sort of challenge the city a little bit on the way that gets spread across the neighborhoods and the wards. And our understanding is that the way those funds get spread out today is it's loosely based on a per acre allocation, which is challenging for the districts that are underserved with parks. And so we think that kind of results in a little bit of a less than fair share allocation for Ward 3. And so we were kind of kicking around ideas as a team about what are other ways of spreading out those funds. And we're highlighting the city of Minneapolis in terms of how they use equity metrics to actually guide the allocation of funds and capital investments, where they're looking at not just the park characteristics in terms of how much acreage there might be and what types of parks might exist in the different zones, but they're also looking at the specific community characteristics. So, what are the sort of, the income levels in these communities? Are these communities that have been chronically underfunded over time? And so there's almost a catch-up provision, if you will, to try to get those districts up to speed and really focus on equity across the system. And so that might be a great case study to look into, and there's others like it around the country, so we wanted to highlight that for the city. So that was quick. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and get into operations. Thanks for having us.
Great, thank you. I'm Erin Lonoff. I'm a principal with HR&A Advisors. We are an economic development consulting firm. And I know it's the end of the presentation, but we're here to talk about funding and operations and maintenance. I promise this is exciting and it's interesting. And it's really important. So everything that you've heard today, I think everyone talked about something that costs money. And it would not be good of us to come in and say, these are all the great things that you guys should be doing in a parks department that is already doing so much with not a lot, without talking about how you can think about paying for these things. It's really, really important to think about operations and maintenance. So along those lines, and this is something that the Parks Department really has already been thinking about, the Strategic Master Plan already set a goal of enhancing operations and maintenance across the parks, growing the percentage of parks in Grand Rapids, the maintenance and growing the maintenance levels of service to grades A and B across the system. As John already noted, the millage has been a great asset to operations and maintenance. About $1 million each year is going to operate and maintain pools across the system. But there's still a deficiency in operations and maintenance. The Parks Department has estimated recently that O&M, operations and maintenance, is underfunded by about $3.25 million. And that's at sort of current levels and the goal of hitting A and B service levels at many of the parks across the system. That does not include a lot of the things that we've talked about today, like a community engagement expert, or new restrooms, or a number of the facilities and sort of both physical operations maintenance facilities as well as the staffing sort of components that we've been talking about today. On the right side of this, just as a sort of comparison and benchmarking for Grand Rapids, we wanted to look at what are the O&M costs today in Grand Rapids and on a per acre basis, and compare that to national standards. Across the board and sort of the nationwide average for cities of about this size, so about 100,000 to 250,000 people, we see that neighborhood parks on a per acre basis tend to have a cost of about $5,400 per acre for operations and maintenance. The Grand Rapids system-wide acreage spending per acre seems to be about $4,000, and we can quibble on this with the Parks Department. I'm sure we can sort of work out some of those numbers there, but it's below the national average on what you would expect for a city of this size. That's not going to be a surprise, and I think this is what the Parks Department has already sort of underscored with the underfunding. And I think it's interesting then to look at some of the sites that we visited during our site study this week. Is the per acre spending is not the same across parks in Grand Rapids. And that's mostly driven by what facilities are in those parks. So Martin Luther King Park, for example, its per acre spending is about $7,000 per acre. And that's in part because there is a pool there that has a high operations and maintenance cost. Plaster Creek Family Park and Campeau are about $2,000 per acre. Again, reflective of the facilities that are there or the facilities, and this is from 2017, so it may not reflect some of the new facilities that are in Campeau. So I think the big piece here then is how can the city grow its operating revenue for parks? And the way that we think about this is really in four buckets. What are the four big revenue, or what are the opportunities from four big revenue streams for operations and maintenance? I think we think about this in terms of earned income opportunities, contributed income, value capture, and public funding. So I'm going to walk through each of those and what the potential opportunities might be here in Grand Rapids, and some of the considerations as we think about some of the other implications we've been talking about for the park system. On earned income, concessions might be an opportunity, and that's something that's really been noted in the master plan. Are there parks that have needs today for concessions, and is there an opportunity for more concessions or some concessions to be put in some of the parks that we've been talking about in the first and third wards? Events, are there opportunities for events? And specifically, maybe there's an opportunity to rotate large-scale events across parks in the city so that you have an event rotating throughout the city, drawing neighbors and residents to different parts of the city each year. Parking, some parks across the country use parking as a revenue source and earned income. I understand that there's already an authority that runs parking, but perhaps there's a way to connect that with parks. I'm not sure about the nexus. I understand that there are some state law restrictions on a nexus test between and sort of an impact and fees gathered and where those funds then get distributed. So that's a question for you all. One of the key considerations on earned income as we think about revenue and operating budgets, as well as park equity, is we need to consider the ramifications of increasing fees, ticketed events, concessions, with creating and balancing that with creating a welcoming space for all socioeconomic levels. So it's not necessarily sufficient to just say, okay, let's create a huge earned income program in our parks. That's not going to balance necessarily all of your goals for creating a welcoming and safe space. So then moving on to contributed income. Today the Friends of Grand Rapids is a great resource for the parks. And other philanthropic sources, there may be opportunities there, but we suspect that they may be limited on the operating side. John talked about the opportunities on the capital side. We think that's a great opportunity. On the operating side, really there's sort of two key opportunities that we see. One is if there are specific programs that tie to a foundation's mission, so for an example, maybe an environmental education class, which we understand there's already a partnership starting up soon in one of the parks in our study area. And another that's frequently used is corporate sponsorship for events or seasonal uses like an ice rink or a sponsored concert series. The bottom line, though, is that it's sometimes challenging to make a compelling story to donors as a way to cover general maintenance costs for parks. And so you really have to think about what the ask is to the philanthropic community and what's going to inspire donations. One of the things that, as a real estate advisory firm, we think a lot about are what are the opportunities for value capture? And as Grand Rapids continues to grow, how might you capture some of that value and invest it back into parks? Value capture most often relates to real estate value. So we know that parks spur growth and value increases. Can you capture some of that and have it reinvested into your park system? But sometimes value capture can relate to non-real estate uses, such as increased retail sales or increased tourism, so more hotel nights. That's not necessarily as relevant in the study area that we've been looking at, but that's how value capture is used sometimes in other places. One of the big challenges that we heard over and over again is that today the state law does not allow for park impact fees. So that's a big barrier between linking development and your park usage and park revenue. But maybe there are other developer incentives or other ways to capture value. And in fact, that's already happening around Pleasant Park with a neighborhood association fee helping to fund the park there today. There may be other opportunities like a BID or a BID being a business improvement district, PID being a park improvement district, or a NID, a neighborhood improvement district. Maybe that is also a similar structure that could be used here. It's very similar to a neighborhood association fee, but may qualify other kinds of properties as well to be included as part of the value capture. TIF is sometimes used as well, so tax increment financing when new development is going in to help pay for infrastructure as part of the developer package. And then as the community continues to grow and as the market changes, there may be opportunities to leverage growth incentives such as density bonuses, so allowing for more height or bulk as a result, and if a developer provides for community benefits such as park space or open space. I understand that already exists to some extent with developments of a certain size, but maybe as the market grows, there may be more opportunities to increase that. But I think one of the key questions here then is the city will really need to balance economic development priorities with inclusive growth, and how that then also layers on and balances with park schools as well, because sometimes they will be contradictory to one another. So that leads us with public funding. The millage has been great for Grand Rapids. I think a lot of people would agree with that, or many of the stakeholders that we spoke to certainly thought so. And given some of the challenges with the other resources, it really leads us to the conclusion that public funding is going to need to be a significant driver for operating revenue for the Grand Rapids Park system. So a few different considerations. If there's broad support, perhaps there's an opportunity to grow the operations and maintenance portion of the millage, or grow the millage for operations and maintenance. Another thing to consider is if it's possible to create some flexibility between the split of capital and O&M, depending on year over year what the capital versus O&M needs are for the park system, and how then the millage gets distributed. Other ways that public funding goes to help goes to pay for parks include general funds, but also occasionally designated taxes. So hotel taxes are oftentimes used to pay for parks, sales tax increases. There are a whole host of ways that communities are paying for parks from a public funding perspective that I think could be considered. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie to wrap this up.
Thanks, Erin. Thank you all for sticking with us. I know we've been talking for a while. We're almost done. Just to highlight and amplify a few of the points that we've tried to leave you with in our presentation, we think there are some short, medium, and long-term things that you all can do to try to look at equity issues in the system and look to the future of the system, and just start by promoting your accomplishments and your own successes. We really felt that there could be a lot more self-promotion happening and a lot more awareness raised actually in the park spaces themselves of what's been done and what's coming. Thinking about securing long-term funding for operations, maintenance, and general staff capacity. And then this whole idea about, hiring a community engagement specialist. One thing, I don't think we said the words, but, we're thinking about equity. Equity is about both changing outcomes and it's about changing process. And so process has to do with ensuring that folks who haven't always been part of the process, who always haven't had their voices heard in the process, get their voices heard in the process. So that really ties back to this whole notion of engaging with the community and really hearing from the community, the whole community. And the folks are going to be most impacted by change in their communities. This is a fast-growing place. A lot of people probably feel great about that, and some people probably feel pretty insecure about that. And we want to make sure all those voices are heard in your process going forward. Thinking about creating strong partnerships for land acquisition and capital improvements and trying to think more broadly about where those partnerships could reside. And then prioritizing acquisitions for long-term inclusive partners, long-term inclusive economic development, and really thinking about what the relationships are that you could be putting in place to get ready for that, enacting that long-term strategy for acquisition. So I'll leave this slide up. It kind of refers to the key points in the 4 different themes we've been talking about. And thank again our ULI Michigan staff for really supporting us, the Grand Rapids Park and Recs staff who supported us this week, the stakeholders that we were able to engage with, your leadership here, and ask if you have any questions. We'd be happy to answer them. We just inundated you with an hour and 5 minutes, but maybe something occurs. We've given you everything you could possibly want and more. Well, we're not rushing out of the room either, so we're here to answer questions one-on-one if you have things that occur to you. Yes?
So since you guys are obviously from around the entire United States, and I heard you kind of say through your presentation at some point that this is not uncommon in other locations throughout the U.S. Are most of these issues similar, across the U.S. for all 4 of those components for cities of our size?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we all really came to that conclusion, and I think a couple of our panelists, Rachel and others, might be able to speak to that best.
So definitely the challenges are what we see across the U.S. That's why we have the 10-minute walk campaign, because we know that particularly in the recession, park and rec agencies took the biggest hit to their budgets. That happened here in Grand Rapids, and we have not recovered from that recession, whereas other city departments have been able to grow their spending and operations. It also took a hit on our operations themselves because we weren't able to staff and maintain those parks, and then, we had significant backlogs in our maintenance needs, and in particular, the campaign targets mayors because they are the ones who control city budgets and have sort of been the driving force behind the amount of spending that's happening in parks and recreation. I think it's really key that we get them on board in this process in order to really recover from that economic recession and ensure that we don't take another hit the next time around.
Aaron's got something to add.
The only thing that I would add to that is that on the operations and maintenance and the capital side, I think given the points that Rachel's pointing out or making here about the recession and what that has done to parks operating budgets and capital budgets across the country, is that that's then led to cities increasingly thinking about alternative funding sources. How else can we fill this gap sort of away from public funding? What are those other opportunities for partnerships with foundations, philanthropy, earned income, and bids and the like? And you're seeing that in cities of all sizes. I worked in a town of 4,000 people thinking about this, and it goes all the way up to the largest cities in our country.
And to piggyback on that, I think the other sort of benefit of being resource constrained is that cities and parks departments have gotten much better at sort of telling a more exciting story about parks and recreation. And it's not just about, green space and playgrounds. It's about mobility and health outcomes. It's about stormwater infrastructure and how all of these different things relate together and work together. So it's a much more exciting story. And so I think the cities that are doing it really well are, overlapping these different ideas and telling a story that's more exciting. So I think that's a positive about the current moment.
I'm sorry, it's me again. The other thing that I want to add to that is that increasingly cities are thinking about parks and rec along with their economic development strategies. Again, we know that parks add value, and that value can be quantified in many different ways. And so they're collaborating a lot with economic development. How do we think about an area holistically about its growth potential, both in terms of real estate development, population growth, job growth, as well as the community benefits such as parks? And it's really important to be coupling those things together because it's really hard to work in isolation in a funding constrained environment.
Yes.
So I really appreciate communication and engagement with stakeholders and residents. But I'm also curious, it strikes me what drives us now is city staff, Parks and Rec. I'm wondering if they've gotten what they need and what next steps are.
What they've gotten from residents?
From this process. And what you
We'll have to put David on the spot. We'll get our grade right now as we finish.
So, great question. I think it's important to preface my response with a little bit of background. And that is, I think what you heard today, and what is absolutely the case for Grand Rapids Parks and Recreation right now, is that we have a very full plate. We have a lot going on, and a lot of momentum and a lot of priorities that we need to strategically begin addressing, one of them being parkland acquisition. But I think it goes without saying that we wouldn't even be here today having this conversation, I believe, if it were not for the residents of Grand Rapids passing the voter-approved millage in 2013. With that investment, we've been making, I think, significant headway, and by so doing, gaining national attention from experts from across the country, leading us to this point today where we are now thinking about our future, not just taking care of the past and neglect that's happened and occurred in our system, but thinking about the future and how we keep up with the pace of growth here in Grand Rapids. So to that end, I believe what we've received here today is extraordinarily valuable information. Not only good examples from across the country and what other cities are trying to achieve and how they are achieving it, but I think laying out for us and for our Parks Advisory Board, who we lean on heavily for some expertise and guidance as well in this process, some components and benchmarks for us to utilize in reaching out to our community and engaging with them as we think about future land acquisitions and where that could occur. So this doesn't happen alone. We're not, flipping on the lights every day and walking into our offices and going, okay, let's buy some property today. We have a lot going on, no doubt about it. And this piece that we've been talking about today, I think, is very much a long-term goal that we've got for us, but one that we cannot forget about. And so I say that because these conversations over the last 2.5 days are extraordinarily important, especially as our city continues to grow and add population here in the region.
I'd like to add to that, if I may. One of the underlying themes that we hope you got, but I'll be more extroverted or blatant about it now, is if you're hoping to grow in acquiring more land for parks because you have that need, and there's no doubt about it, you have to demonstrate to the community that what you already have is serving them well. And that way you have the buy-in to say, you know, what, these parks are great, look what's happening over here, we need one over there for y'all too, so let's, I guess that was from the south, wasn't it, y'all? So let's do some more of that. And so that was an underlying theme too, and that's why there was so much emphasis on advertising and promoting your successes and building on the facilities you have now, is that's the launching platform from which you can build on.
Oh, no.
Other questions, thoughts, or comments? If not, I would like a big round of applause to the team. Again, from Grand Rapids, we are very grateful for your contribution of time and expertise. We have been looking forward to this for a long time, and we are so grateful for your presence here this week and sharing with us your knowledge and your experience. So thank you again.